Hello my sardines and anchovies. Today we will be learning about what some call the most beautiful race in the world, the Mille Miglia. This video will be split into sections and you can skip to whichever you like with the timestamps in the description box below. Without further ado, let's get into it. Quick disclaimer, I don't speak Rust, so I'm probably going to butcher like 95% of the words and names here. Our story begins in 1927, where a group of wealthy Italian men, those being drivers Franco Mazzotti and Aimo Maggi, journalist Giovanni Canestrini, and sports manager Renzo Castagnetto decide that La Dolce Vita wasn't sustaining them anymore. So, as anybody would do in this situation, they start a 1,000-mile race running from Brescia to Rome and back. It wasn't a race against other cars, but instead against the clock, with drivers competing for the fastest total time. Cars would be released at 1-minute intervals, with smaller displacement cars being the first to go. The race would run 24 times between 1927 and 1957, and you don't have to be a mathematician to see that 24 is smaller than 30, and that's because the race didn't run for 6 years. The end of the competition, as with other racing series such as the Targa Florio, was caused by the danger present, more specifically a crash that took place in 1957, but we'll get to that later. So, where did they drive? Well, to answer that question, let's have a look at some of the routes throughout the history of the race. The first route, in place from 1927 to 1930, called for drivers to begin the race in Brescia, go down to Parma and Modena, then curve past Bologna before heading down to Rome via Siena. After that, it's up to Gubbio, and from there it was right to Ancona, followed by a straight run to Bologna. The final quarter of the race took place from Bologna to Verona via Treviso and Feltre, all terminating in Brescia. As stated before, this route was in place from 1927 through to 1930, but this would change slightly in 1931, with the route being altered to pass through Cremona and Casalmaggiore. The 1931 route would be raced until 1934, where it would be extended further to Piacenza and Casalmaggiore be cut from the race. The other change on the track was the removal of Feltre as a checkpoint, Treviso replacing it as the highest corner on the circuit. In 1937 and 1938 things get iffy. I get one source saying that it made a big change to the circuit and another saying the 1937 circuit was very similar to the 1934 one, which I'll bank on as it's a primary source. The 1939 track differed significantly to previous iterations, given that it didn't exist. This was caused by the banning of the race in 1939, following an accident where 2 amateur drivers lost control of their car before it crashed, ending the lives of 10 spectators. The 1940 route sees dramatic changes from all previous ones by being a lapped circuit instead of a sprint, with the circuit forming a triangle from Brescia to Cremona and Mantova. Dare I say, a mini Miglia. Spectators much preferred this style of racing as they got to see the cars pass, more than once. From 1941 to 1946, the race didn't run for obvious reasons, but the race did continue in 1947 with a significantly different route. The major differences were the separation of the figure 8 circuit into a more typical loop, and the extension of the route all the way to Torino alongside the reversal of the direction that the race went. Same with the 1948 route, but in 49 we once again see changes, with the route being reverted to being anti-clockwise and the Torino section being effectively punched back to Pienza. The middle of the track was pushed out as well, so instead of heading to Bologna and Firenze, they'd hug the coastline down to the south. The final major change would be the extension of the route to Pescara in the southeast. 1950 changed the track slightly as to pass through Bologna and Firenze, and changed it to running clockwise once more. In 1951 the route changes again, with drivers going through Siena instead of the coast on the run-up from Rome. 1953 sees a small change, with the track shifting up a bit to go to Terni in the south. 1954 reverts this change because the Italians are more inconsistent than my upload schedule and creates a little dent near the finish line, making the track hit Cremona and then Mantova. This marks the final change in the track up until its end in 57 and the final recovery of my sanity. The final year of the regular Mille Miglia took place in 1957, and that was due to one fatal crash at the end of the race. The car involved was the number 531 Ferrari 335S, driven by Alfonso de Portago and navigator Edmund Nelson. 70 kilometers out of Brescia in the town of Guidisolo, the front tire of the Ferrari exploded, causing the car to skid off the track. It took out 9 spectators during the crash, as well as both Portago and Nelson, before it finally came to rest in a small stream next to the road. The reason for the crash was deemed as Portago not changing out the heavily worn tyre in order to win the race. 3 days later, the Italian government banned the Mille Miglia as well as racing on public roads, leaving the final winner of the race as Piero Taruffi with a 3-minute lead over Wolfgang von Trips, the second-place driver. But was it really over? Well, no. Kinda. You see, the race did continue in 1958 through to 1961, but was heavily restricted, with racers driving at legal speeds with the exception of small sprints on private roads. As you may have guessed, this was quite unpopular with the fans, so the race finally ended in 1961, marking the end of the Mille Miglia. That would be the true end of the race, but in 1977 the race was revived as an exclusive event to cars that had registered or raced in a previous Mille Miglia before 1957. So now I'm going to talk about some of the most personally interesting cars and their respective races. The first car I'd like to discuss is the Alfa Romeo P3, and this is because it differed pretty substantially from the other competitors, but also the other Alfa Romeo P3s produced. What I mean by that is that the car was modified significantly to meet the requirements of the race, with changes such as replacing the monoposto, or single seat, with two small, and I'd imagine rather cramped, seats. Other changes include the addition of lights, mudguards, a self-starter, and spare wheel, among others. This gave the car a slightly more conventional appearance in comparison with the typical cars of the time, but it still retained the more race-like body style. The car ended up winning the 1935 race with a time of 14 hours and 4 minutes, 46 minutes ahead of second place. The second vehicle I'd like to talk about is the Maserati A6 GCS, which raced in the 1954 Mille Miglia and ultimately placed third with driver Luigi Musso and navigator Augusto Zolka, with a time of 12 hours. What makes this car interesting, aside from the personally questionable appearance, is the 311 GT by Fornasari Cars. This is a retro-designed GT with a coach-built body that harks back to cars of this time, the 1950s, and I think it looks quite nice, and their Instagram and website are linked below. The third and final car I'd like to talk about is the iconic Mercedes 300 SLR, which drove in and won the 1955 Mille Miglia. Powered by a meaty 290 horsepower inline 8 ripped out of the W196 Formula 1 car, it was driven to victory by legends Sterling Moss and his navigator Dennis Jenkinson. They completed the route with a time of 10 hours and 7 minutes, not only beating the second place driver by 32 minutes, but also setting the fastest time in the history of the competition. So, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching this video. If I made any mistakes, do let me know in the comment section below, and if you have any suggestions for a future topic I could cover, you can let me know there too. I hope you enjoyed it, and with that, I say au revoir.